Welcome to the channel. In this video, I want to discuss the most recent Kill Team balanced data slate, how it might affect the game, but also what it tells us about the direction that the game itself is going in. Righto, chin chin. So overall, the balance patch can be summarised with a few, different overarching decisions. First of all, obviously, Sanctifiers did take a jab in the patch. They can't use their double move first turn, lead procession. General consensus is this isn't enough, but I think one of the most sort of revealing things from that decision is Games Workshop's statement on their actual balance patch article. They kind of stated, we don't want to change the team too much because we want our customers to get, their time in the sun. They want to let their customers enjoy the new product as is. And I don't know if they'd feel, they'd make that kind of statement if the team really sucked. Do you know what I mean? It's interesting that they see that time in the sun, that kind of dropping of a new team as a sort of, a first hurrah, even if the team is clearly quite overpowered. It reminds me a lot of I used to play a lot of League of Legends, and playing ranked in League was like it was a nightmare every time a new champ's released. Sometimes they spend patch after patch after patch remaining OP because Riot was intimidated by the consumer base, by people wanting to get their worth out of a new champion, or in this case get their worth out of a new team. So I think it's just an interesting it's an interesting view into the mentality of the devs, and I wouldn't be surprised if rules sell models kind of thing. That's something that's been said before, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's like maybe even like a marketing decision as opposed to a dev decision. Who knows? But either way, that's just something interesting to take from that initial, Sanctifiers taking a hit, taking a nerf. The next sort of big overarching decision was an uplift to all of the struggling teams. That is to mixed effect. I mean, you can hardly say, the bonuses, the positives to Kazakin, for example, are on the same level as breaches. Yeah. The kneecapping, or the really sort of overarching nerfs to all of the Eldar teams, other than the Mandrakes and the Blades of Cain, as an archetype almost, they all took a hit. And pointedly, sort of the next big umbrella, I suppose, within the balance patch was the not nerfing of the Marine teams. The not nerfing of the elite teams is also very telling about like their sort of the direction they want the game to go in. And finally, obviously, there's been a lot of cleaning up of time and windows to mixed effects. Chaos Cults didn't get that clean up for some reason, where everybody else did. But they're trying to do things to the engine of Kill Team around timings and stuff like that, which I do think is a noble effort, but maybe needs to be enshrined in the core rules rather than just in an errata. Either way, let's start breaking it down. So the first thing I was going to discuss is the uplift to the struggling teams. Again, this has been very, very sort of hit or miss in terms of overall efficacy. The Vespids and the Aquilons, the starter box team, both got their out of the box extra operative, which is it's very good buffs. Henkin's got plasma knives. Pathfinder's got their guns back. Death Corps are getting sort of ongoing increases to this shooting reliability, kind of half in, half out in terms of success. Galapox are almost back up to where they were really towards the end of the last edition of Kill Team. So you've got, again, across the board, you've got a lot of very effective buffs, and then you've also got, other teams which seem to be, left out to languish a little bit. Breaches, Hunterclade, for example, have hardly really been touched. Very, very minor buffs. Breaches can move through access points for free, and Hunterclade get essentially a free command point. They don't need to pay for one of the stratagems if their leader is in line of sight of a unit using it. I mean, overall, very hit or miss. However, I do think it was a net positive overall. I think with most teams, they've at least made a very strong gesture, a very strong token effort at a minimum, and at a max. I mean, bloody hell, Vespids and Aquilons are gonna be, they're gonna have real teeth now. I certainly think Vespids, they could be a menace. If someone rolls hot now with all the extra, activation economy and stuff like that, they're going to be difficult to deal with. I think the size of them is going to be an issue almost as well, with all their operatives on the board and how big their wings are. They're going to have a hard time deploying too. So I kind of wanted to move on to something linked, I suppose, to this uplift to struggling teams. That's the fact that this balance patch, it's really sort of given some teams a proper identity, especially for like the normal guys, the humans. This is something I was talking about in my hopes and expectations. I wanted a real sort of addressing of the normal dude teams, Breaches, Kazakin, Arbite, etc., etc. So I do think, generally speaking, that has come to pass. Maybe not in the case for the Breaches, but certainly with the other teams. I think the team's in a difficult position, really, when it comes to, teams of normal humans, because it's hard to create an identity, within the confines of them being, normal guys, 7 wound models or thereabouts. And sometimes this can kind of, this quest for a real team identity can be, dialed up to 11, as we can see with the Sanctifiers. They've just kind of, given these guys a human chassis, and then just layered on rule to create, a monster almost. So I do think they have a very difficult sort of tightrope to walk in that regard. However, we have seen the Death Corps and the Kazakin approached in the balance patch in such a way that it kind of creates that identity. So less so with Death Corps, because it's less, they had changes in the previous patch already, but their hold the line stratagems and abilities are now linked to defending an area. It kind of hedges them into like their kind of trench warfare, holding corridors, defending, war of attrition sort of routes, I suppose. Whereas the Kazakin changes have obviously been far more expansive. They've basically kind of reimagined the team around the Recon Trooper. It's kind of created a more cohesive identity for them, In a way, they've really doubled down on the kind of like Aliens universe, Colonial Marines vibe with the motion detector. And I do think that's a cool, this cool thing to be doing. It's a cool identity to give them, when they were obviously one of the most sort of bland teams you could play. So not only did they get sweeping buffs across the board, but also, importantly, a cohesive identity. And I do think it kind of gives us an insight into why some teams like Breaches, maybe Hunterclade, and stuff like that are sort of being left out in the cold. They're being left to languish, maybe because they don't have a sort of a concrete identity, and they want to nail that down before just increasing stats. I definitely think that this willingness to give a team a proper identity in the balance patch is very good for the game, especially in regards to the teams that they're tackling. It's showing a willingness to engage with teams, even though they're going to be declassified. It's not just the new cool stuff. There's a willingness to engage, with legacy content with declassified teams, and I think that's massive for the health of the game. I mean, I sound like such a shill here, but I just think it's good for the health of the game that they're at least reviewing older teams that are going to be, coming up for declassification. We can't discuss the teams that have been buffed without discussing the teams that have been nerfed. The Eldar teams have taken an overall hit in this balance patch, and I do believe really that's linked to the power fantasy of the Eldar teams in general. Obviously, in a game like Kill Team, which is all about action economy and movement, having your racial trait, your power fantasy being linked to extra APL, free dashes, action economy and stuff like that is it's intrinsically strong. It muddies the water between a horde team and an elite team. This is obviously an intrinsically strong, trait, or an intrinsically strong power fantasy to balance a team around. So I think maybe that's why they've been targeted, in sort of an umbrella fashion, as opposed to just, targeted nerfs on individual teams. Obviously, Corsairs have taken the biggest hit. In the balance patch, I think they're kind of the Kazakhin's opposite number. They've received the most expansive sort of nerfs. Hand of the Archon were kind of caught in the crossfire here as well. They were essentially the next best Eldar team. By dint of being the next best, they also took a hit because maybe the devs thought the Corsairs players would just jump onto Hand of the Archon and continue to dominate with the elf teams. And Void Dancers, again, they kind of took a token nerf, but they've already been nerfed in the previous patches. The Sadeth, that was rarely used anyway, got nerfed, but it still delivers a sort of a statement of intent, I think, in terms of the direction of the game, and certainly the direction of elf teams in their sort of power level. I think they're still going to be, very strong, but they're going to be far more punishing to play. I think that's kind of telling of what Games Workshop want of the elf teams. They want them to be finesse teams. They want them to be, high risk, high reward teams, as opposed to kind of factions that muddy the water between the elite and horde sort of archetype. But the fact that these guys took nerfs in this way and Marines didn't is probably the most telling thing about the balance patch, in my opinion. This moves us on to the last principal decision within the balance patch, and that was essentially not to nerf Marines. The elite teams themselves, by all metrics, have been performing more consistently, and yet they still haven't been nerfed themselves. So we just take a look at the nerfs that they did receive initially. So a minor nerf to reactions, which essentially only covers Angels of Death, is basically their only nerf. Not even a direct nerf to the team itself. Plague Marines maintained their healing and also taken a nerf to Cloud of Flies. Warp Coven only took a minor hit to Capricious Plan, but they maintain, all the sorcerer's powers and stuff like that. And all these kind of minor nerfs are, these are essentially within the frame of all their bad matchups, the Eldar being, nerfed quite heavily. So this tells us that the devs are essentially happier with the overall feeling, I suppose, of elite teams at the moment, which I think anecdotally I would back up. Everyone I know who plays Marine teams tends to have fun. Even when I'm playing against them, I feel like these guys feel like they should. It feels like you're fighting an uphill battle. Never seem to die in one hit. They've always got options, and I just think it's a well executed power fantasy. So it would be a miss, in my opinion, for them to chase a 55% perfect stat sheet across the board at the expense of it feeling cool. Essentially, it's crazy. In a game which is already quite competitively leaning, I think you've got to hold on to things feeling correct, things feeling cool. And I think one thing that the Marine teams do, and the elite teams in general across the board do, is they deliver on it feeling like a Space Marine should feel. So generally speaking, although maybe not straight down, straight edge, good for the balance of the game, I do think Marines not being nerfed, even though the elves took a hit, is probably the correct decision, or at least the least worst decision that the devs could make. And just to be clear, I don't play elite teams. I play Brew Brothers, so I haven't got a horse in this race. This isn't my own sort of personal bias showing through here. I just think they feel correct. To summarise the changes in the latest balanced data slate, then, I would say we've seen an addressing to some of the timing issues in the game. A kind of engagement with the engine of Kill Team, so to speak. Definitely something that needs to be enshrined in the core rules in some way. It's a shame that the app only has the light rules. If we had the core rules for the game within the app, we would just be able to add a whole section via an errata relating to timing in the game. But unfortunately, I suppose that's not possible, and we'll just have to settle for an errata. But at least those sort of engine based sort of background rules issues are being addressed in some way. I'd say the devs are showing a willingness to give teams a proper identity. So with the Kazakin, we've seen the formation somewhat of a proper identity through an errata, which is it's interesting, especially given it's not one of the newer teams. Hopefully this gives teams like Breaches a little bit of hope for the future. We've also seen a real willingness to engage with teams that are going to become declassified. So if we look at Galapox, Deathcore, Pathfinders, Corsairs, whether it's buffs or nerfs, we're seeing a willingness to engage with older content, with older teams, which shows, I think, care for the overall ecosystem of the game and the overall balance. Marines aren't going to be nerfed, in any greatly impactful way, I don't think. Whether that's good or bad depends on what side, what side of the fence you're sitting on. But for me right now, I think maybe, for the health of the game, it's not really an issue. I think the most telling thing will be how they handle the next crit ops, which is going to be in the next 3 months or so, I think. Maybe November, actually. But I think how they handle Marines now on the elite teams and how they play into the new crit ops will be a really telling, it will be a really telling point in the development of the game. Obviously, Eldar have taken a huge nerf across the board. Maybe play Blades of Cain or Mandrakes if you're going to play Eldar. And finally, Blood and Zeal definitely still needs another round of nerfs. I think anyone who's going to tournament should earn double VP if they're facing a Blood and Zeal team. I hope you got something out of this macro level look at the latest balance patch. If you've got any ideas about what direction the game might be heading in, whether Space Marines should be nerfed or not, or any comments about your own factions and things like that, please pop them in the comments below and we'll have a little discussion there. Cheers.